gonna do something different today. So in the last couple demos I've made, I've kind of gone over new topics. I've actually taught the faking nature paper a bunch of times before. The Leibniz piece is more of a fun piece. Today I'm gonna actually revisit something I've publicly written on my Substack today, namely the 2024 election dissection or postmortem, whatever you want to call this kind of thing. I'm gonna pretty much go through what I wrote there and think now, some 8 months-ish later, what I think about the things I wrote then. I'm not gonna bring up too much new information, though I do think some new things are worth highlighting. And also with some current events. This is gonna be a little more casual than my other two videos, in which I kind of spoke fast and quick and covered a lot of topics. I'm gonna try to stay relatively precise and follow my Substack post before. I'll link it in the description below if you wanna read. I'm not gonna cover everything I wrote in that piece, but I'm gonna cover a good amount. There are some things I don't still think, so it'll be interesting to see how my thoughts have changed. All right, let's jump in. So the first thing I want to say is that I think when someone's approaching electoral analysis in general, I think it's wrong to ask the question, why did X beat Y? Just in principle. I think that's usually a bad explanation, both in historical cases and present cases, but rather I think it's better to look at each individual campaign as individuals. Right. So take the case of the 2024 presidential election. Kamala Harris performed significantly worse in terms of the total number of votes she ended up getting in the popular vote than Joe Biden did in 2020, whereas Trump roughly actually received more or less the same number of votes. So I think you have two different questions you have to answer. Why did Kamala Harris fail to match Joe Biden's 2020 numbers? And separately, why did Donald Trump manage the same number of votes as he got in 2020? And I think those are actually two different questions. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to tease these apart and kind of go back and forth. Again, if you want to read the Substack post, you can kind of follow around, but I'm going to say some different things than I say there. Kamala Harris first. I still stand by my position from before that I really don't think the Harris campaign could have done that much better. I do think she was given a losing hand. As a matter of fact, I think like a historically losing hand. So let's reflect on this for a moment, because I do still think this, and I still think this is my strongest position I'll advance today. Joe Biden already is controversial because he's the oldest president in U.S. history. He had refused to engage in a primary cycle. A quite serious thing. Yes, he's the incumbent president, but he also had previously promised to be a one-term president. He had some clear dissent. Yeah, RFK Jr. ends up being his main opposition, which, oh my God. Yeah, there's too much to say about RFK Jr. in this one video, but you can get my thoughts by just that initial reaction. And this was well after Joe Biden had already made moves to make any possible primary challenge more of a serious challenge to his potential challenge. That's a weird way to say it. He made it easier on himself. He pretty much helped South Carolina become the first state in the Democratic primary, a state which is historically very conservative by comparison. One that the Democrats do not win historically, but that Joe Biden performs the best in. So imagine a new primary cycle in which Joe Biden actually was seriously challenged. Yeah, the first state would have easily gone to him. He historically is very close with the Democrats in South Carolina. And I'm saying it's a bad thing, but I do think it's a bad thing compared to other options. Yeah, Iowa and New Hampshire shouldn't go first in the Democratic primary. I think Georgia should have gone first. But Joe Biden probably would not have fared as well in Georgia in an open primary. But none of this matters. He chose not to go through that public scrutiny. And I think he's culpable for that. Right? So when we get to this first debate, a debate which is so historically dismal, it receives its own Wikipedia page. Yeah, Joe Biden's campaign's dead in the water. It even takes him 2 weeks to be convinced of that. His historically bad debate in which he says he's going to something like defeat Medicare or something like that.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
If you haven't ever watched that debate, just go watch it. I'm not going to go into the debate, but I'd be a masochist to go rewatch it. So at the time, people floated the idea of having a contested convention. I still stand by my view that this is probably not a viable option, even if we imagine ourselves back in that situation, right? So imagine the situation. Joe Biden's the incumbent president. He's not doing super well in popularity, in large part because his handling the Israel-Palestine conflict, or just the Gaza war, if you want to call it that. Imagine if the Democratic Party didn't allow Kamala Harris to run, though, right? We have the first woman to be the vice president, the first black person to be the vice president, the first Indian American to be vice president, right? She is a historical candidate. So it's not so much the question of, would the voters have picked her in an open primary cycle? I think probably not. She didn't win her own primary and she ran against Joe Biden before. But it would look awful to the Democratic insiders to not pick the incumbent vice president. It's not a realistic option. I mean, imagine the headlines, right? Kamala Harris defeated a contested election. Democrats do not run black candidate or woman candidate, black woman candidate, black woman Indian candidate. Part of the Democratic branding is their approval of DEI measures and whatnot, or this emphasis on historical progress where it matters. I do think visual representation matters. So imagine your median voter who knows about the Democratic Party, likes this about the Democratic Party, even if they're not necessarily super loyal to the Democratic Party. They wouldn't vote for that. That'd be nuts. You can't drop Kamala Harris to run Bernie Sanders at that, or Pete Buttigieg at that point. No. So Kamala Harris, in some sense, is forced to run at this point. I do think it's a bad thing, but I don't really think it's her fault that she ends up in that situation. Right? She's the vice president on Joe Biden. I think it's reasonable to expect to be loyal to Joe Biden. So when Joe Biden, in some sense, makes a really serious mistake, she ends up with it. She has to go with this. So what could Kamala Harris have done differently? I really don't think much. I wrote this before and I still do think this. The primary season is incredibly important for a politician to develop their own political identity. The closest thing I think we really got this for Kamala Harris was the Brat Summer branding. Side note, love that album. But compared to someone like Donald Trump, the former president, so many political mottos and symbols associated with him. Build the wall, tariffs on China, make America great again, the great deportation, so on. I really don't see how come July, a few months away from the presidential election, that she gets to that same level of recognition as someone like Joe Biden did. Joe Biden was the vice president for 8 years, was one of the most recognized senators for decades before that, kept running for president or kept wanting to run for president. I think really her logistical staff around here also just fundamentally failed. Consider the fact that most people in my circles didn't even know that she endorsed the federal legalization of marijuana in October. And I think part of that is because people didn't take it seriously. Joe Biden had made the same promise, and it never happened. It still has never happened. So, yeah. So when I originally wrote this section of my postmortem, the primary season matters, and I actually do think that this is a lesson that I really do hope the Democratic Party learns from this. You can't just not have a primary because you have the incumbency. No, if the incumbent president's going to face a serious challenge, that's important, actually. And it's mainly important as to get one's brand out there. Kamala Harris should have had that opportunity to really build up her recognition. Similar to, say, how Bernie Sanders became a national profile in 2016. But because of Joe Biden's deception, particularly, who I do think is the main person to blame in this case, the Democratic Party fundamentally undermined public trust. And I do think this is the main explanation as to why they lose turnout. All right, let's talk about Trump now. I do not think you can beat the person who brands themselves as the fighter. This guy who thinks his election was stolen and he's coming back. You can't allow him to be this kind of underdog figure, right? He's the guy who says you have to fight like hell. He's the one who gets shot and puts his fist up, whatever, right? Donald Trump's brand has never been one about reasonable policy debates or whatnot. He's the guy who stands on the debate stage, makes quick jabs. He's somewhat witty sometimes. I think sometimes he's also just a dunce, but some people like that. You can't give him the situation in which he's the comeback kid. And I think the Democratic Party really played into this. We'll talk about this more in the next section. But by branding him as this threat to democracy, I mean, he was the president before. So yeah, like, do I like Trump's politics? No, I mean, there's plenty of analyses about his, like, quasi-ideology. But it doesn't matter. His ideology doesn't matter for the purposes of electoral politics going into the 2024 election, right? People that aren't in the loop about the news see the comeback kid. They see his little quips. They're not happy with how the Joe Biden administration's handled things, especially post-first debate. So yeah, why would you, if you had voted for Donald Trump before, why would you not vote for him again in that situation? I think presently, when I'm making this video, there are new reasons for it, specifically the Los Angeles protests and the federalization of the National Guard, which I have a bunch of other thoughts about, but I'm not going to cover in great detail here. By giving Trump a good fight, in a way they played right into where he does best. This kind of irrational confrontation, politics in which he can get away with saying things like he has the concept of an idea in a debate. I think this is parasitic on the first section of this video. Like, I think this is only possible because Joe Biden and his inner circle puts the Democratic Party at a national level in this position for the presidential race. But it's a serious point. Like, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump's mental capacity over what will eventually be 12 years now, even more than that if you count his initial run in 2012, he's in his element. It's more like 2016. He's the guy who people don't expect to win in the beginning. He has to be the one who fights his way up. So in a way, this enables him to stay consistent in his popularity. Because again, that's the second thing we're trying to explain here. All right. Enough about Trump for now. We'll come back to Trump. What about Kamala Harris's campaign ideologically should she have done different? Sorry, twisted my tongue there a little. Right, so before we talk about like the practical situation, that I do still really think that almost impossible is to overcome that. Like, the incumbent president just straightforwardly, such a disastrous debate that he drops out. I don't think there's coming back from that, practically speaking. But what kinds of things could her campaign have done differently that I do think could have given her better odds? It's worth at least going through. I do think the first thing, and I do still think this, is that a stronger stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict would have resulted in her doing better. I specifically think this in the context of the current ongoing Swift Daily riots and protests around the United States in response to the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the failure to establish a lasting peace. The parallels to the 1960s and the Vietnam War are really striking and increasingly striking, specifically with the use of force against those protesters. And I think specifically with what I would call a lukewarm nomination speech. Yeah, she was scrutinized for playing both sides on the matter, I think rightfully so. And I don't think it would have made a ton of sense for her to come out strongly in a way that beyond what she did. She eventually called for a ceasefire independently of Joe Biden's administration. But I don't think anyone was going to take her seriously on this, no matter what. Even if she really does mean it in her heart, she was still the vice president under Joe Biden. And so in a situation in which 63% of independent voters, as polled in March of 2024, opposed the then current Israeli military approach to the war in Gaza. Right? So this was a long time coming. This was a known thing. It's been over a year now since that poll was done, and I would imagine the numbers are still roughly the same. And yet, the Democratic Party, which is historically supposed to be the anti-war party, failed to really grapple with this. And I think this is well beyond Kamala Harris herself, but I do think that's something that could have been done differently. And I think this would have mattered specifically to the young vote, which we'll talk about more later. I think there's this bigger point in which I think this is a problem with the Democratic Party in general in recent history, is that you have a relatively narrow set of Democratic insiders deciding on what the party as a whole focuses on. And I don't think that those messages are often the messages that are going to most move the independent voters. I think Democratic strategists are often really concerned about losing what they consider to be like their core middle line of the party. I think this is just fundamentally an incorrect approach to like their planning of platforms in the last roughly 20 years. Right? So I have this chart from Jacobin I like. Sign up, a socialist magazine, so there is some bias here, but I still think their methodology in this particular study is good. All right, so I used a bunch of rhetoric, and they used focus groups to see which kind of rhetoric most resonated with voters. And the Democratic threat, and sadly the immigration critical, I would have to double check. I don't know if immigration critical means critical of Joe Biden's current approach, then current approach to immigration. You can go look for that in yourselves. Report back in the comments if you do. What matters is that the Democratic threat rhetoric was the least convincing rhetoric used in the study, whereas the rhetoric around rising economic inequality, by a good margin, resonated with people more. And this is not new. This is still the same kind of situation we face now. It's the same kind of situation we have faced for a very long time, since probably roughly the 70s, right? And for some reason, the Democratic Party, which is historically supposed to be the working class party, continues to not take this issue seriously enough. And there's a bunch of different explanations to why you think this could be. I think the main reason is because they're just scared of the donors, both Citizens United, at least in recent history. Doesn't explain the full trend, but I also think the Reagan era has a lot to do with this. I think the key takeaway, and I think the thing that the Democratic strategists get specifically wrong, is that your median voter is not motivated by like these big ideological concerns about what liberal democracy entails, but rather they're really worried about their bread and their families. They're motivated in some sense by not just self-interest, but this sense of their personal well-being. And I think that the Democratic Party in 2024 did specifically poorly at that, reaching that message, right? This abstract threat of Donald Trump's going to end the democratic democracy. Yeah, I think the democratic democracy. The Democratic Republic of the United States, which the democracy versus republic thing, I think is a stupid debate. If you want to hear more about that, ask in the comments, whatever. The Democratic Party, I think, specifically failed to reach people about the issues that they, at the time, thought were going to affect their individual lives. I think currently you have the situation in Los Angeles and other major metropolitan areas of the country in which this has resulted in boiling over. Like, people are being very personally affected by the immigration crackdowns. But that being said, part of the scrutiny around Joe Biden's administration is that they weren't particularly good on immigration. So, I don't know. It feels like a catch-22. It feels like an impossible thing to go back and convince people that actually Donald Trump will deport a bunch of people. They didn't already know that. I mean, part of the issue is just reaching people with a limited bandwidth. And so if you're saying something like, oh, Donald Trump's going to end the American democracy. Well, he was already president before. So if I'm someone who's not that involved in politics, and I see that strikes me as silly. He's already been president before. All right. In my original Substack post, I worded this third lesson as, do not underestimate the importance of hot topic voters, especially those compared to the appeal of the unenthusiastic middle. I don't know if I quite would word it that way now. I think the better way to word my point here would actually be focus on what people care about, right? Like this abstract idea of the threat to American democracy. Yeah, like I'm an academic. I'm incredibly worried about that kind of thing. Donald Trump's attacks on the university has like directly affected me. But for like your median, again, low involvement voter, the thing they're worried about is like the inflation crisis. Or if you say it enough, immigration, if they like have immigrant family and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, those are things that matter. And yet we find ourselves in a situation in which now the country has to, in some way, deal with the ramifications of this. And I've already hinted at my own thoughts about this, but I want to stay on topic here today. Maybe in the future I'll come back to this. All right, so that's enough about Kamala Harris's campaign. Let's finish up my analysis with Trump's campaign. The main narrative, what I would say is the main narrative post the 2024 debate, is that Trump won because he gained with Latino voters and young voters. I'm a little skeptical of this narrative. I think there's a better way to dissect what happened. So I'll go through it. Let's start with the young voters thing. I don't think that it's right to say Trump won with young voters, because I don't think he won with the then typical young voters, right? He gained with young voters in large part because he gained significantly with first-time voters, right? I call this the dude vote. Trump won first-time voters 56 to 43%, a whopping 13-point spread, right? And 8% of polled voters were first-time voters. I said this then, I do think this now. I think this is largely a result of his podcast, Blitz, at the late hour of the election. And allegedly this was a suggestion by his son, Barron Trump, so shout out Gen Zers, I guess. It's a stroke of political brilliance. But I also do think that, like, in the future, the GOP shouldn't rely on this. I don't think you're going to get a personality like Trump who's going to do as well on, like, the alternative media circuit as he did. Right? Like, people like J.D. Vance have gone on Joe Rogan, but it's not the same vibe. I know it's a little simple of the way. I've never listened to the full episodes, but come on. Part of the appeal of Donald Trump is that he can kind of just, in a sense of myself, shoot hoops with someone like Joe Rogan. This is just an unknown. I think this might just be some kind of interesting nostalgic effect that, oh wow, the president, when I was really young, lost, and now is coming back. And you have some kind of weird nostalgia because you start seeing him as like the comeback kid, as I discussed in the earlier section. So I think this is a more specific phenomenon than just he won over young voters. I think specifically he won over otherwise non-voters, which I think is an important distinction. All right, what about the Latin vote? I do think Donald Trump's gains with the Latin vote in 2024 were quite remarkable. So in 2020, he lost Latin votes at a ratio of 32% to 65%. Whereas in 2024, he only lost that vote by 46 to 54. But I again think this is better explained not by Trump gaining in votes, but rather Kamala Harris's campaign, or just the Democratic Party more generally, losing Latin voters. Right? What remains unclear, I'm still unclear about this, I haven't seen any convincing statistics about this, is that actually what happened is that the Republican Party more or less was consistent in their support, whereas the Democratic Party, as a result of Joe Biden not sufficiently addressing concerns around immigration during his presidency, were quickly losing their historical voters, right? So the Republican Party is gaining percent-wise, but it's not clear to me how much they gained nominally. Were they actually getting more voters? That seems unclear because, again, Donald Trump roughly got the same number of total votes as he got in 2020, whereas the Democratic Party lost votes by comparison. So this is still unclear to me. I would like to see information if people have done more specific studies on this. I don't know of any. I still don't know of any. I definitely think this won't stay the case. Again, the thing I keep talking about, like the LA protests and like the immigration crackdown we're seeing currently. So, yeah, I don't think this is something that will persist, but I do think it's worth pointing out. I think it's more so Democrats lost Latin voters and need to do more to get those supporters back if they're going to restore that coalition, but we'll see. Lesson number 4, still stand by this. Never estimate Joe Rogan. All right, let's wrap it up. Yeah, I mean, my old conclusion was roughly, I'll try to be a little nice. I do think that we need fresh faces in politics. And this is particularly frustrating because, like, the young vice chair of the Democratic Party who was trying to do exactly that, get new faces in politics, is now, like, being pushed out because of party infighting. I think party infighting actually is a healthy thing in this kind of case. As I already said before, like, we shouldn't be suppressing the primary cycles. But the Democratic Party seems hell-bent on losing, so whatever. I do think, regardless of how people feel about Harris, I do think it is really hard to blame her for how her campaign went. Like, a presidential campaign is not just the candidate. There's like a whole team around you. It typically takes months and months to build that team. The primary cycle plays a really big part in like getting your name out there, connecting with people. So I still do think that, I think if anything, the big lesson that we'll take away from the 2024 election in the future is I think Joe Biden is going to be amongst the lowest rated presidents in US history, right? I mean, regardless of how you feel about policies like Build Back Better or Biden's endeavors to deal with the problems he was facing in his presidency, he ultimately just ended up being a really controversial president who directly, or his inner circle directly, enabled their electoral loss in the following cycle. I think this is really devastating to his legacy. I think if Joe Biden did not run in 2024 and allowed there to be an open primary, I don't think Kamala Harris would have won, honestly, because again, she was in number 4 in 2020 off the top of my head. But that primary cycle would have enabled the Democratic primary voters, or independents voting in the Democratic primary, to pick a nominee. Maybe it would be Kamala Harris, but then her name would be out there and she would have gone through that muster, that scrutiny. And that scrutiny is really important to like your average voter who's just keeping up on the headlines. And I do think if the Democratic does this, if Joe Biden steps out earlier on and sticks to being a one-term president, again, as I believe he promised, I don't think we would be here today talking about what year is it now? The 5th year of the Trump presidency? Yeah, we haven't hit a full year yet. Oh God, it's been a hell of a first 200 days or whatever of his second term. So yeah, I'm really tired of living in the second Gilded Age. And we'll end it on that. As usual, like, comment, subscribe, tell me what you think. A little different of a video today. Kind of fun to put more political science-y hat on. I hope you enjoyed.